for proper and logical flow of these finance-related matters. I think before we hear the Chair of Budget and Appropriations Committee on the proposals in the Appropriations Bill, it is fair that we know that, first of all, he has capacity to finance his entire budget. So we go to business appearing as special motion, number 16.
Order number 16, special motion, variation of public debt ceiling.
Leader of majority.
Yes. Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, I beg to move that pursuant to the provisions of Section 52 of the Public Finance Management Act of 2012, this House approves the Public Finance Management National Government Amendment Regulations 2022, published as legal notice number 89 of 26th of May 2022, thus approving the amendment made to the Public Finance Management National Government Regulations of 2015 Principal Regulations in Regulation 26.1 by deleting paragraph C and substituting therefore the following paragraph. The new C to read, pursuant to the provisions of Section 52 of this Act, the public debt shall not exceed 10 trillion shillings. Honorable Speaker, as members will recall, when the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury and Planning appeared before this House to highlight the estimates and financing proposals for the financial year 2022-2023, he did allude to the fact that he would be making a proposal to the House to, in the first instance, to change the manner of computation of debt or debt limit as to be capped at 55% of the GDP. And thereafter, the draft was then tabled in the House and given to the Committee on Delegated Legislation, and consultations commenced as per Section 5 of the Statutory Instruments Act, which require that any regulatory making authority to consult in instances where the proposed regulation may have an indirect effect on business, among other reasons. And as the consultations were going on, it became very clear that even the proposed formula of 55% of GDP at net present value terms was making it much more complicated, and hence we needed to get to a situation where people can relate and say what exactly is our debt limit, rather than be pegged on is a net present value at rates that are being determined by different players. And without that standardization, then the committee did suggest that perhaps we need to go with what is known. We know the debt limit right now is 9 trillion. Let us look at what we need to do in the very interim to accommodate our financing requirements, to accommodate the issues that we have at hand, to sort out a limit that will accommodate the budget, that will accommodate the issues in this transitional phase. And in a year's time, in 2 years' time, the incoming government, whoever they will be, will be able to look at their programs and their financing needs and come to this very House and propose their issues. So this is the very interim measure that we are proposing here today. Because as we were looking at the BPS, members will remember, it became very clear that the proposed estimates within the BPS were going to overshoot the 9 trillion set ceiling by some figure. And even a shilling is overshooting. But the figure was in the order of 200 billion, 400 billion, and I think it has since shifted. And I'm sure the Chair of Budget who will give us the exact figures in terms of that. So realistically, we are in this situation where we cannot do a budget for this country now unless we adjust our financing limitation that we put on ourselves. We've just passed the finance bill in this House. And I believe within the measures that taxation measures that have been proposed was to raise an extra 57 billion over and above what we were collecting last year. But this House has also looked at some of those measures and said they hurt the common man. They increase the ordinary pain of the ordinary Kenyan. And some of those have been reduced with the effect that they have reduced that projection of 57 billion to somewhere like 32 billion. So we already know what we can get from taxation. We already know what we can collect from our tax revenues. And the balance must be what can only be financed realistically through borrowing. Hence, we know that whatever happens, we must be able to increase our budget, because the alternative would be to look at the total budget and slash the budget across the board by 600 billion. But what does that do to the incoming administration that will be voted in by Kenyans in August of 2022? It means that we will be giving them that this House has passed a budget that is unrealistic. It cannot be able to finance the operations by 600 billion. And because you can only vary the budget by 10%, what it means is that even in the best, at best if they bring a supplementary, it will need to increase by something close to 150 billion. And hence, we will have emasculated them by 400 billion. So the most important thing is we must remember that we are in a very unique situation. We are doing a budget for an administration that is out there planning, making its plans on what to do. But we must provide at least for the very basics. There are salaries to be paid. There is debt to be repaid. There is, consolidated fund services, pensions to be paid. And all those things have to be budgeted by this House. In addition to the ongoing developmental programs, because if it gets stuck, we are in trouble. So this is really a very unique situation that we are in. And it's not unique to Kenya. Since the onset of COVID, we started seeing most countries getting into this situation where the capacity to raise revenue was constrained. The demands for extra expenditures was enhanced, and nobody really wants to think of debt. And this, the original dilemma of taxes versus debt was now expanded to this other trilemma that also we are having expanded spending. So, Honorable Speaker, it may look like, I know people have talked about debt and talked about debt as it's evil. But debt only becomes evil if you use it for the wrong reasons. If you take your mortgage to buy a house and you end up buying a car instead, yeah? Or you buy a flat and use the balance to get a car, that is bad. And that cannot be excused. But if you take your mortgage and you buy a house, you are better off than the person who decides that because they hate debt, they will start accumulating a pile of stones every month until they have enough stones to build a house. Yeah? And we've seen that happen with people who fear debt. They buy a truck load of stones, some sand, some cement. By the time they are constructing the house, the cement is already expired, and a few iron sheets. And 20 years down the line, they start constructing the house. Well, the smart one actually goes to the bank and says, here is my pay slips. Yeah? I expect to be working in the next 10, 20 years. And hence, my cash flow into the future is I can leverage on it to actually take a debt, buy a house today, and enjoy the benefits of that house forever. It's the same thing with countries. We've taken into account that SGR will be there for 100 years. So the debt taken on the SGR cannot be paid for in the next 5 years. It will be paid by 5 generations of Kenyans over the next 100 years when the SGR will be used. And hence, we shouldn't be really worried about debt so long as a house, we can look at where is this debt being applied. And I believe in this house we have the reports that have been submitted in terms of what the debt has been used for. And the latest I think I tabled here was relating to this particular year, I think to March of this year. So members may want to look at those reports and say, have we used our debt as we planned to? And I'm sure the chair of Parliamentary Accounts Committee will also be telling us on what we've done, because we have 9 trillion that we have borrowed. But if we have 9 trillion of assets also to show, then we are good to go. And indeed, or 13 trillion to show. So it means that we have actually leveraged, we have borrowed 9 trillion and created assets worth 13 trillion. So we are 4 trillion better off on a simplistic basis. And hence, so I want to debunk the myth that borrowing is bad. Indeed, the IMF used to be one of the advocates of trying to tighten up and say countries should not borrow beyond 60%. And some of those economists, like Michael Blanchard, who is a retired IMF economist, is now the biggest advocate of companies or countries to borrow, so long as your rate of borrowing is less than the interest rate, than your projected growth. So it's a growth-adjusted interest rate. If your interest rate is lower than your growth rate, then you're encouraged to borrow and crank up your economy to grow at a faster rate than it's costing you to invest in it. And it's the same thing, like we are saying. The only reason we encourage members of parliament to borrow is because the mortgage rate is lower than the inflation rate. And hence, it makes sense to borrow today and have a house than trying to save your money or even using the crude ways of accumulation of stones to ever build that house. Now, the ideal situation would really be not even talking about the absolute figure of 1 trillion, an extra 1 trillion, would be a percentage of GDP. And hence, I'm looking at this as a very interim measure. And I'm hoping that the administration, because there will be an election and there will be a new administration coming in on 9th of August. And I would want to encourage them to actually come into this house. And we have, a rate-based cap that it's so much as a percentage of GDP or as a percentage of something else, so that as your GDP increases, so should your capacity to borrow. As you borrow, so should your GDP also increase, so that we are not limited. Like I imagine the member, TJ Kajwang, if he was told, you can only borrow 5 million regardless of your earning capacity. You're basically ignoring the earning capacity of that person and putting everyone at par. But when you say that you can borrow a certain percentage, which is what SACCOs do, you borrow based on your shares, right? So the more shares you have, the more capacity you have to borrow. And basically that should be the way it is. Anyway, it's a topic I love, and I can assure you that from where I sit, I encourage people to borrow. I encourage companies to borrow. Typically, we expect every company to only use 30% of the initial capital and use that as a lever to borrow another 70%, so that if you really want to invest 10 million shillings in a business, you only need to raise 3 million. There's 7 million that you can get from out there at a certain rate. And when you make profits, if you make a profit of 1 million shillings, you'll be making 1 million shillings produced by 3 million, not by 10. Because the 10, 7 does not belong to you and you pay the interest on it. But your only contribution is you have 3 million, invest in a business that is worth 10 million. You make 1 million shillings in profit. It's not 10%. It's actually 1 million out of 3. So it's quite a good business. But if you didn't borrow and you just stuck to your 3 million shillings a small kiosk, you will never get far. So I'll be happy to give some lessons on that offline. But especially since we don't know what will happen after the elections, and I'll be happy to consult, especially those who may not make it back. I'm sure I'll be here around with a few of the members who are here. The reason they are here today is they are confident they are coming back. Those who are not confident are panicking out there. So we pray to God that those who are here can actually make it back so that we can continue these discussions for the common good of this country. Basically, I think I really don't want to go through a lot of that. I want to urge this House that we take this. It's not quite a bit appeal, no. It's something we have to do out of necessity to save the budget for this year, to save the generations to come, to ensure that the new administration can have a budget that they can implement as they figure out how their manifestos fit into what we have. And we don't constrict them that you can only work with 50% of a budget, which means nothing. And we'll actually be punishing Kenyans. So with those remarks, Honorable Speaker, I beg to move that we actually amend to create that room for purposes of processing our budget, and with our proviso that come next year or at some point in the future, the new administration will come and rationalize what they really need into the future with the new House. I beg to move and ask the Honorable Kamket, the Chair of the Committee on Delegation, to second.
Honorable Kamket.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I beg to second. Mr. Speaker, the Committee on Delegated Legislation is properly seized of this matter. This matter, the position that has been as addressed by the Leader of Majority, is actually a compromise position. Because we, as he ably put it, Mr. Speaker, we find ourselves at a very unique position in terms of budget implementation. And after a lot of consultations, Mr. Speaker, it became necessary that we move away from the position of removing the ceiling based on, to have it based on a figure instead of a percentage of the GDP, which was being proposed as a world best practice in the current situation, in the current dispensation, economic dispensation of the world. But Mr. Speaker, honorable members were a bit uncomfortable with the ceiling based on the GDP, ratio of the GDP, because there were conflicting figures on the actual size. So therefore, it became necessary that instead of basing it on a non-figure, it became necessary that instead of basing it on the GDP, we just put an open limit that everybody can see that the debt ceiling should not exceed 10 trillion shillings. And we thought as a committee that that was the best way to go. So, Mr. Speaker, I beg to second. I thank you.
Honourable members, I propose a question, which is that pursuant to the provision of Section 50, subsection 2 of the Public Finance Management Act of 2012, this House approves the Public Finance Management National Government Amendment Regulations of 2022 published as legal notice number 89 of 26 May 2022, thus approving the amendment made to the Public Finance Management National Government Regulations of 2015, being the principal regulations in Regulation 26, Subregulation 1, by deleting paragraph C and substituting therefore the following paragraph. C, pursuant to provision of Section 50, subsection 2 of the Act, the public debt shall not exceed 10 trillion shillings. Member for Kikuyu, Honorable Shungwa.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. And Honorable Chair, Honorable Speaker, thank you to the Honorable Angonyi for the correction. Honorable Speaker, I beg to rise to oppose this particular motion, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, the issue of public debt, and I understand what the Leader of Majority is saying, and I know where the Chair of the Budget and Appropriations Committee sits. But Honorable Speaker, the issue of public debt is not something that we ought to be justifying to ourselves, to appease ourselves, because it is a burden that we are laying on the shoulders of the Kenyan people. And that burden, Speaker, as much as I heard His Excellency the President the other day on Madaraka Day telling us that debt is simply us utilizing other people's money. But Honorable Speaker, as much as we are utilizing other people's money, it is not money that we are getting as a grant or as a gift from those other people. It is those other nations' taxpayers that are giving us money to invest in productive sectors of our economy, Honorable Speaker, and at the end of the day, use our taxpayers' money to repay. And therefore, as we lay more burdens to the Kenyan people, Honorable Speaker, as the people's representatives, I am obliged to object to the raising of this debt ceiling, Honorable Speaker. And it tells you the Cabinet Secretary in charge of the National Treasury today is a man who clearly has no understanding of what he is doing. The Honorable Kamket has just told you that initially they had brought us a percentage. And if you look at a percentage, they were giving a percentage as much as it was on NPV terms of our GDP at 55%. However much you try to cook GDP on NPV terms at 55%, we would still be below the 9 trillion debt that we have today, Honorable Speaker. Therefore, Honorable Speaker, this slight or huge variation to 10 trillion shillings will be a burden to the Kenyan people, Honorable Speaker. But more importantly, Honorable Speaker, it is outside what this House has approved in our medium-term debt strategy paper. Beyond that, Honorable Speaker, this House, and I have chaired the Budget and Appropriations Committee, so I speak from a point of knowledge, that we have demanded from the National Treasury that every year, before, and there have been resolutions in this House, Honorable Speaker, before you tell us how much you are borrowing, earmark for us the specific projects that you intend to utilize that public debt on. Today, Honorable Speaker, we are increasing our debt to 10 trillion shillings, and we cannot earmark projects where this money will go into. Even the appropriations bill we'll do today, we'll be discussing today, Honorable Speaker. If you look at the estimates that are there is nothing specific on what specific projects will be financed using public debt. Honorable Speaker, the greatest danger, we are also, I think in the course of today, Honorable Speaker, if I look at the order paper, bound to discuss the supplementary estimates too, at the end of the financial year, Honorable Speaker, or at the tail end of the financial year. And I see the chairman of budget winking at me because he knows I know what I'm speaking about. Honorable Speaker, the reason why we are doing a supplementary estimate too is because we spend out of the budget, Honorable Speaker. It is the spending out of the budget, and I take great exception to what the Leader of Majority was saying, that we are spending in very good things that are for the benefit of the country. Honorable Speaker, you beg to ask yourself, when you spend things that are out of the budget cycle, you will end up borrowing. And this is a government, this is a cabinet secretary in charge of the National Treasury who has a very high aptitude, because he cannot stand up to his president to tell his president that sprucing up public parks in a country where people are dying out of hunger is not a priority, Honorable Speaker. And budgeting is about priorities, Honorable Speaker. How much money have we spent sprucing up Uhuru Park? How much money are we spending to spruce up Uhuru Gardens? And I don't know why they're all Uhuru. Honorable Speaker, in fact, I would dare propose that one of these fine days, we should rename Uhuru Gardens to Freedom Gardens. Honorable Speaker, I am not saying this because I have anything against anybody, but I have a problem when we spend money in non-priority areas and more so spend public debt. You cannot tell us that the Nairobi Expressway, Honorable Speaker, that we have spent it, and His Excellency the President must shy away from telling the people of Kenya on national days things that are not true. That the Nairobi Expressway has not spent a coin of our taxpayers' money. Honorable Speaker, I know for a fact this expressway has not spent not less than 20 billion Kenya shillings of taxpayers' money. And it is therefore wrong for the president to purport that the expressway, which Kenyans are now paying for, and paying to companies that we cannot tell who owns them. Look at the CR2 of the company that is managing the expressway, Honorable Speaker. A company that is registered in Dubai, Honorable Speaker. As a single shareholder, the Chinese on that CR12, and I've seen it, Honorable Speaker, are mere proxies. Honorable Speaker, these are issues that if we as a parliament are shy from discussing, Honorable Speaker, and we sit here today and approve a debt of 10 trillion shillings, we are killing Kenyans with a burden that they cannot bear. It is okay to borrow, and I have said this before. But a nation, and even ourselves, I heard the leader of majority saying that if you have the capacity to take up a mortgage of 5 million shillings and you're able to pay, well, go ahead. Mr. Speaker, today, this country is not able to repay its own debt. Our CFS, Honorable Speaker, those in the National Treasury will tell you, this January, they had to borrow from the domestic market to be able to finance our public debt, Honorable Speaker. And that is the danger that we are living in. But we are dealing with a regime and people who have no aptitude to think about the ordinary Kenyan who is suffering, Honorable Speaker. It is burdens that we are laying on the Kenyan people. How I wish we were more innovative in terms of being able to expand our tax base by simply expanding our bottom. And that is why I don't know where they get jittery when they talk about bottom up. Bottom up simply means that we will expand our tax base at the bottom of the pyramid, the economic pyramid, Speaker, so that we get more taxpayers into the tax net. Honorable Speaker, we must also reform our KRA. I do not know why today, Honorable Speaker, KRA, if you speak to DG Uhuru, he will tell you for the last 3 years, he has not been able to recruit new staff. Honorable Speaker, when we gave them money in 2019, I think 2019-2020 budget, the first supplementary after I left the seat of chair budget, that money was all removed. KRA today is an institution today that we must restructure and renew so that even part of the money they are collecting from taxpayers is done as a percentage of what they collect. We must recapitalize or rather empower KRA in terms of the amount of money that they get, and maybe probably give them something close to 5 or 7.5% of the revenues they collect, so that we encourage them to pay their staff better, be able to recruit more people, and be able to collect more money from taxpayers. There are very many people in this country who do not pay taxes, Honorable Speaker. But what we are confronted with today is a regime that is more intent on killing business, Honorable Speaker, than encouraging taxpayers. Today, Honorable Speaker, if you go to Naivasha, a thriving business that was being run by the lady called Tabitha Karanja, simply because Keroche Brewery is, Honorable Speaker, simply because and out of her political affiliation, Honorable Speaker, that factory today is closed down, rendering close to 3,000 people, taxpayers, jobless, Honorable Speaker. You go to Thika, Honorable Speaker, the factory that was run by Humphrey Kariuki, that employed close to 5,000 people, has been shut down. Honorable Speaker, I want to say as I conclude, because I see time is over, that we must empower KRA to collect more revenue. We must rebuild our economy from the bottom up, and I rise to vehemently, Mr. Speaker, oppose the increment or the variation of this public debt ceiling, because it will be a further burden to the Kenyan people, Honorable Speaker, and I beg to oppose.
Honorable Wandai.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for this opportunity to comment on this very important subject that is before us, the subject of public debt. And Mr. Speaker, before I proceed, I really wonder why Honorable Chungwa is so emotional. You know, unlike him, I want to refuse to be emotional, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, or perhaps yes. Mr. Speaker, let me proceed and protect me from the honorable buyer. Mr. Speaker, you know, I have the advantage of having been the chair of the Public Accounts Committee. And this is a matter we have pronounced ourselves on. Last time in our last report that we tabled here, it was adopted last week, I think, the 2018-2019 report. I've got two issues, Mr. Speaker. Firstly is the matter of the record itself of the public debt. This is an issue that we keep to haggle around. And we recommended, Mr. Speaker, if I may just remind the House, in our report, that we needed to have Section 64, subsection 2 of the PFM Act amended to make it obligatory for the National Treasury to prepare, publish, and publicize an up-to-date national debt register every quarter of the financial year. Because, Mr. Speaker, we have heard stories, really, and conflicting stories for that matter, of how much, in essence, this public debt is at any given moment. That is an issue that needs to be addressed once and for all. Second, Mr. Speaker, is the matter of the borrowing. We have proposed as a committee, and of course because of the process of processing bills, that amendment has not come to pass, even as we prepare to adjourn. Mr. Speaker, we had proposed an amendment to Section 50 of the PFM Act to make it mandatory for the executive or the National Treasury, for that matter, to come before this House anytime they want to commit the country to a debt burden of 1 billion shillings and above, so that this House gives the final seal of approval for any debt agreement that is entered into between the Kenyan government and the donors or the lenders, so to speak. We hope that in the fullness of time, even for those of us who might be lucky to come back in the next parliament, that this amendment will go through, so that we don't leave this matter of committing the public to borrowing in the hands of the executive or the National Treasury exclusively. That this House should play an oversight role right from the outset. But having said that, Mr. Speaker, I want to agree with the Honorable Chungwa on one account, that debt per se is not a bad thing. And that has been elaborated at length, even by the leader of majority a while ago. The most important thing is, to what use do we put debt, Mr. Speaker? To what use do we put debt? There are conflicting schools of thought as to whether the money we have continued to borrow in this country has been put to good use or not. And that's a debate again which can go on forever. But the most important thing at this defining moment, Mr. Speaker, is that we must prepare ground for the next administration to be able to transact the business of governance without any hindrance, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and therefore, in my view, I see a situation where we are in a catch-22 kind of situation. We are damned if we do, we are damned if we don't. Because the next administration would have to get fiscal space, would need fiscal space to be able to transact business of governance in terms of providing essential services, indeed all services to the public, and to be able to meet the obligations. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, inasmuch as it is fashionable and indeed populist to be tempted to oppose this proposal, I refuse to go that direction. I refuse to go that direction in the sense that as a responsible house, even as we want to seek answers as to where public debt has been put to in the past, we must be responsible enough to be able to allow the next administration to operate effectively. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I will be supporting this motion, but on condition, Mr. Speaker, that the administration that is going to come, Mr. Speaker, is able to demonstrate that it is going to be using this debt in a responsible manner, in a manner that is going to bring value, going to add value to the public, Mr. Speaker. And that is the most important thing. Rather than to sit back and say now, because perhaps in the past this money has been misused, let's now refuse to allow this borrowing to continue and therefore put the next administration into serious jeopardy. That will not be responsible of us. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, let us approve this motion as we caution the present administration and the incoming one that it must utilize public debt in a responsible manner, Mr. Speaker, that adds value to the Kenyan people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support.
You see, I'm surprised at the tail end of the 12th Parliament, the member for Kitutu Church North doesn't. I thought we went electronic. You don't just put it there. You also press. But also just to inform the Honorable Jimmy Angwenyi that the standing orders which you've just approved have actually established a committee of this House to deal exclusively with the matter of national debt and privatization. So those of you who are coming to the 13th Parliament, look forward to that very active committee.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I hope I'm a member of that committee. Anyway, be it as it may.
Somebody suggests that you should be retiring. That's why the member for Mutembei is suggesting.
Semeji.
But I need to inform the member for Mutembei that the Honorable Jimmy Angwenyi, the indomitable lifelong member for Kitutu Church North, has no intentions of retiring. Proceed, Honorable Angwenyi.
Okay. I'm very young, the way he says. Because my systems work, all the systems. That's where you determine whether you are lost or not. Now, Mr. Speaker, I rise to support this motion. And I would like to, where is Ichungwa? I would like to tell him, to educate him where he maybe not learn, that some of the countries which have moved from third world, first world, and I can mention 3, even 4, have had to use debt to develop and move from third world, first world. One of them is Hong Kong. The other one is Singapore. The other one is South Korea, which borrowed money from Kenya 1971. And the fourth one is China. China, in the last 30 years, because of using money which is borrowed, has developed to be the second largest economy in the world. And we want to be the first, the highest economy in Africa. To do that, we need to borrow money, we need to invest, so long as we apply it in proper investments. Like the one which has been, which was launched yesterday, whereby we insist on the manufacturing. Mr. Speaker, a few years ago, I attended a World Trade Organization meeting in Hong Kong. And in the morning, when I went for breakfast, I could see a lot of people. But between morning and 6 o'clock, between 8 and 6 o'clock in the evening, you don't see anybody even on the road. And I asked our consular, what's happening? Where these people go? And he told me, let me take you around. He took me to a place, a factory which was manufacturing candles. And he said, this is a factory manufacturing candles and has got employees, 2,000 employees. And there's an order from Kenya of 30 million shillings for candles, which you can manufacture in Kenya. And he told me, these candles are manufactured out of crude oil, which you get from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is closer to Kenya than it's to Hong Kong. And he took me to another place where they're manufacturing clothes. And he told me this factory has got 5,000 workers. And there's an order from Kenya of 50 million shillings for clothes. And they said, this factory has got an order of that much. But also, that part of that order is for Mutembei. The clothes which have been used, which this factory buys, then it sells to Kenya. And they said that manufacturing factory of clothing gets their cotton from West Africa, from Senegal. And Senegal is closer to Kenya than it is to Hong Kong. So what I'm saying is that if you can spend that money well, spend it in manufacturing, spend it, Yeah, there's somebody is disturbing me from there. I'm saying, if we apply the investment, the debt, appropriately, if this House can insist that whatever we are seeking in debt must be applied to specific projects. If it's manufacturing, specific manufacturing, then this country will move to the first world instead of being third world. Those few remarks, I was going to close, but I cannot close after his interjection. When we raised the money from 6 billion to 9 billion, he was the chairman of budget. And him and my chair of Honorable Limo, a very nice man, and they were chairing. It was rigged out, I understand, but which is very bad. Now, Ichungwa was the one spearheading the increase from 6 billion to 6 trillion to 9 trillion. Now he's opposing only 1 trillion. I can't understand that. With those few remarks, I beg support.
Well. Let me hear the member for Alego Usonga.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker, for giving me this opportunity to make a contribution on this motion, the variation of public debt ceiling. Honorable Speaker, I rise to support this motion, but even as I do this, I'm cognizant of the fact that there are many questions on how we procure and utilize our public debt. But Honorable Speaker, I support this motion because recently I raised a question with Treasury on how much money, or what percentage of public debt has been spent in my constituency for the last 10 years. And Honorable Speaker, the answer I got was that the government has spent about 150 million Kenya shillings in constructing an administration block at Sia Institute of Technology, which is domiciled in my constituency. And I asked myself, Honorable Speaker, if the public debt is 9 trillion, and my constituency, which consists of about 400,000 people, have only benefited 150 million Kenya shillings, yet the debt is around 9 trillion. It means, therefore, that I need to fight for my people to benefit from this debt. Therefore, I want this debt to be increased, and when it is increased, about 500 billion must be spent in my constituency for my people. Because we cannot complain about public debt when my people have not seen the benefit of public debt. So, Honorable Speaker, what I want to say is that we are going to borrow more and more until my people benefit from public debt. The public debt is not as high as possible. We cannot say the public debt is high until my people benefit from it. So I want to urge Honorable Chungwa that if you think public debt is high, it is high in your constituency, not in my constituency. Honorable Speaker, let us support this motion because the incoming government will need resources to be able to run the government. But Honorable Speaker, more importantly, let me say that I think this parliament is failing. The way we audit or monitor budget is not the way it should happen, because I think the budget is being run through executive fiat. And if this House is going to be very serious, then we could find a way of monitoring the budget and ensuring that whatever we budget for is spent appropriately. And I want to urge the House that in future, let us reject this issue of Article 223 being used to spend money outside the budget. It's not right. But for now, let us support this motion. I support it. And I want to urge the incoming President, Raila Amolo Odinga, to ensure that this part of this debt is used in Alego Usonga. Thank you.
Honorable Atandi, you are aware that the control of budget makes quarterly reports on budget implementation. And those reports are always tabled here. Some of those documents that have always been tabled here by the leader of majority, but I've always said, departmental committees, please look at those reports, because you will be able to monitor and raise the red flag at the appropriate time. So even as you say this towards the tail end of the 12th Parliament, you are now saying that you have failed, because the reports from the control budget are there, and they indicate how the budget is being implemented. And that's why they are brought here. This is a constitutional obligation on the office holder to table those reports. And whenever they are brought here, they are tabled. But I've noticed that many committees, either because of work and perhaps now that we have just approved the new standing orders, you needed to maybe set up another committee for budget implementation monitoring. But I think it would be better if departmental committees regularly looked at those reports and called those people to come and explain what it is that they are doing with the monies that you have appropriated to them. Member for Mutembei.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, listening to my friend Honorable Atandi, I thought he was an accountant, but he's just spoken like a layman. He's an economist. Okay. Then, Honorable Speaker, having listened to the majority leader, also the old man of the House, there are things that don't make logics. Because as much as you are trying to say to justify borrowing, you should be able to borrow when you can be able to repay. If you are not able to repay, then you will cause some distress to yourself and to also those you are borrowing on behalf. And I think by raising this ceiling to 10, we are causing more distress to the Kenyans, to the Mwananchi, because what it means is that it will create a lot of, there must be some bit of taxation, increase in taxation for these people to be able to meet those obligations and for the country to be able to even repay for that debt. So, Honorable Speaker, I don't support this variation to 10 trillion because when you look at it, in 2005, our debt stood at 700 billion. Today, 2021, 2022, we are talking of around a debt of close to 8 trillion, which is many times more than what we inherited at 2005. And therefore, are we really borrowing responsibly? Because I don't think anybody, Honorable Kimunya tried to explain himself so hard that I think he was straining even to understand what he was saying. Because when you want to borrow, when you want to borrow, let's say from a bank or from any institution, you should have the capacity to repay. You are not just borrowing, because he gave an example that you are borrowing for mortgage. When you even borrow for mortgage, it will be cheaper if you get the money and use that labor to build the house for yourself. But if you are going to borrow for mortgage to buy the house, and then you are left with some money that you want to buy a car, and you don't have the capacity to repay for that, then it is distress. You are causing problems to yourself. Where are you going to raise the money to repay that mortgage? So, Honorable Speaker, I think looking at even the programs that people are coming up with, look at our presidential candidates. One of them said that you will be paying people 6,000 every month. When you borrow to pay people 6,000 every month, how will you be able to repay that money? Because you are giving people 6,000 for consumption. It's not capital. It's not a capital investment. You know, some people are shouting, but you're shouting for the sake of shouting, because even your constituents are looking at you and wondering, you are going to borrow 6,000, give somebody 6,000 so that this person can consume. How does that come into you to be able to repay for that money? And you are banning Mutumba. Huh? The same Mutumba which would have costed that person even 6,000, you are now saying you don't want that Mutumba. So, Honorable Speaker, I think some of these issues that we are trying to put up in terms of raising this variation, varying the debt ceiling from 9 to 10 trillion, I think it should not happen, because we are going to put Kenyans into a more hardships. We are going to create more problems, and considering the environment in which we are in, that some of even the companies, I heard yesterday one of the companies manufacturing, I think some cooking oil called cooking fry, is even closing down because of some challenges. So I think because of state capture, yes. And those are the kinds of things you have resources being captured by a few people so that the rest can trickle down, and then instead of widening the base for taxation so that everybody can feel good. With those few remarks, Honorable Speaker, I want to oppose.
Member for Kitui Rural.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, I rise to support this motion to vary the public debt from 9 trillion to 10 trillion. Mr. Speaker, debt is not a bad thing, so long as it is utilized in productive sectors with high socio-economic impact. Because debt, well utilized, it will increase the economic growth, it will increase incomes, and reduce poverty. Secondly, the country should be able to service the debt. If the country is not able to service the debt, then there is no need of taking a debt. Mr. Speaker, 2021, the World Bank did a study on state of world debt. And this study shows that all the developed countries, they have over 100% debt to GDP ratio. Example, Japan. Japan, their debt to GDP ratio is 257%. Now they are surviving. Sudan, which is our neighbor here, they are at 210% of GDP. Greece, they are at 207%. Although sometimes they faced challenges in servicing their loans. US, which is a superpower, they are at 133% of debt to GDP ratio. Kenya here, we are at 70%, and we are complaining. I don't think we should be complaining. We should be saying we should even be increasing our debt, but make sure the debt is utilized well. Mr. Speaker, this country, as we speak now, the budget we are trying to pass is facing a financial gap, which we have to finance. And each one of us here has a project in his constituency or in his county which need to be financed. And I'll tell you, the money we are collecting in tax revenue is only doing two things. One, service the debt, which is around 900 billion. Two, paying recurrent expenditures, which are around 700 billion. And therefore, we need to borrow to borrow to finance our budget. But Speaker, the administration which is coming in need to do several things so that at least we reduce our debt. The first thing is we need to live within our means. If we live within our means, then we may not require to borrow. Second thing, we need to modernize our tax correction system and expand our tax base. Mr. Speaker, three sectors: manufacturing, ICT and communication, finance and insurance, which contribute only 17% of GDP, contribute 53% of tax revenue. And therefore, these sectors are being overtaxed. Therefore, the country needs to look at other sectors, to bring other sectors in tax brackets so that at least these sectors are not overtaxed. And I was looking at the excise tax on beer and spirits.
Other members, who is this with who is this? Surely. Proceed, Honorable
Yes.
Mwalika.
So, actually, I was looking at tax level, excise tax generated from beer and spirits. It is actually going down. And this one confirms what we call lava cap. Lava cap is a cap which shows that at one point, there is a limit at which, there is a point at which, if you increase tax, the tax levy started going down. So we need really to look at other sectors, increase our tax base, and raise revenue. In any case, if you reduce revenue, people are going to have high disposable income. When they are going to have disposable income, they are going to consume. When they are consuming, they are paying pay as you earn tax, and the revenue increase. Mr. Speaker, the country needs to move to borrow more concessional loans, which are cheaper, and retire the commercial loans, which are very expensive and strangling this economy. Mr. Speaker, we also need to pursue fiscal consolidation, reduce wastage in the public sector, and therefore we have more money to finance our budget and projects. Lastly, we need to look at the issue of corruption. A lot of money are being wasted and lost in corruption. With those few remarks, I support, Mr. Speaker.
Chair of Budget.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker, and I rise to support this motion. But as I support Honorable Speaker, I want to thank you, Honorable Speaker, on your wisdom to rearrange the order paper so that we first of all dispense off with this issue of the debt ceiling, because the budget for the 2022-2023 has a deficit of about 846 billion shillings, whereas we have a legroom of only about 200 billion shillings. So thank you, Honorable Speaker, for that. Honorable Speaker, I want to also make it very clear that the alteration of this debt ceiling is actually not affecting this financial year or affecting this government. This financial year, 2021-2022, is fully funded, including the debts that we are actually borrowing, and also including the legroom that we have. Governments operate in perpetuity. And Honorable Speaker, this one we are doing for the next government. We are doing for the budget of 2022-2023. And we are doing this as a stopgap measure, Honorable Speaker. This issue of us having a nominal figure, an absolute figure, where we say that our debt is a particular figure, Honorable Speaker, as a country we need to have a discourse and discuss whether we need to put it as a matter of anchor figure to the GDP. Honorable Speaker, in a layman's comparison, Honorable Speaker, if you have a salary of 10,000 shillings, maybe you can borrow up to 7,000 shillings. But Honorable Speaker, if your salary increases to 20,000, you have the latitude of borrowing up to maybe 15,000 shillings. So when we grow our wealth in terms of the GDP, then it means also that we also need to have more legroom for borrowing, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, as I support Honorable Speaker, I want to point out a few issues that maybe the next administration should focus on. This current administration has, of course, focused on infrastructural development, which, of course, is, you can see them everywhere. You know, the superhighways, the express highway, the electricity connection, and all that. We need now to focus also on the software. Make sure that we have more industries, we have more people being employed, and we create more jobs for our youth, Honorable Speaker. And that's a challenge that we have for the next government. Honorable Speaker, you know, my good friend, the Chairman Emeritus, who, in a very unlikely event that his team wins, he might find himself in Treasury. If, in that unlikely event, finds himself in Treasury, without the alteration of this debt ceiling to 10 trillion, then there will be no budget. So, Honorable Speaker, this one, we are not just doing for this administration, Honorable Speaker, we are doing it for posterity, we are doing for perpetuity, and we are doing it with an open arm, and giving the other administration time, maybe 1 year, so that now we can have one year, Honorable Speaker, so that that regime will bring a sustainable way on how we need to address our debts. Honorable Speaker, it might not be a popular decision now to say that we are altering the debts, but it is the right thing. We cannot fund the next budget if we don't alter the debt ceiling, Honorable Speaker. There are some who will be very emotional here. There are some who will say all manner of things, but the truth is we cannot fund the next budget without altering the debt ceiling. Honorable Speaker, the prudence that we are also putting to the next cabinet secretary in the next government, Honorable Speaker, is to tell them that they have to have total disclosure. If they are borrowing for infrastructural development, it has to be specific, because sometimes they borrow for infrastructural development. However, it is put in the general budgetary support. Honorable Speaker, those are some of the things that needs to be worked on, Honorable Speaker, in the next administration. Honorable Speaker, I also want to correct what my good friend Kimani Ichung'wah said, that we are not supporting KRA. We are actually supporting KRA. And as Honorable Speaker, if he has to check, even on our estimates, you see that we have even given an extra 1 billion shillings so that we can also enhance their operations and also employ more staffs. Honorable Speaker, with those very few remarks, I want to support and say that, Honorable Speaker, I beg to support. Thank you, Honorable Speaker.
Member for Kilifi North.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to stand here and oppose this debt ceiling review, Mr. Speaker. Because those who say that removing the cap on the debt ceiling and allowing this government to continue to borrow, and we have seen here the leader of majority really struggling. For the first time, I have realized that our friend, the leader of majority, is actually not just an economist, but a pseudo-economist, because he's really struggled to explain things that really don't make sense. One of the things I want to tell him, that transparency in investment is key in debt management. If you're not transparent about the things that you're investing in, then you are not borrowing wisely. And if you're not borrowing wisely, you should not be allowed to borrow. And that is what we are saying. We should not allow you to borrow if you cannot invest transparently the money that you are borrowing. And that is one of the principles in debt management and borrowing. If you do not invest transparently, don't borrow. This country, and we know a lot of the projects that have been done, there's no transparency in them. Even the Auditor General has questioned and put, gray areas in the amounts borrowed and the things that have been done from borrowing. Today, this parliament will take the debt ceiling to 10 trillion. Now, if we take it to 10 trillion, what assurances do we have that there will be transparency in the investments that will be made out of the borrowing that you are making? Secondly, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say this, that this country has been on the penchant of supply-driven development instead of demand-driven, such that I heard the minister, the CS for infrastructure, saying, they went to China and some Chinese guys came and said, you see, we can build for you an expressway like this one. And they showed them pictures. And they called the president and said, Mr. President, there is an expressway. There's some guys here who can build an expressway. And they accepted it. Was there a demand for that expressway, or it was because there was a supply for the expressway that they accepted to do it? A lot of these projects are actually supply-driven. Chinese come here and tell ministers, we can do this for you and you'll make this much money. And people accept. And therefore, you have a road in Mombasa that is being built at, I think, 1 billion shillings a kilometer. A road that leads nowhere, 1 billion shillings per kilometer. Why? Because the Chinese came and said, we can build this road using this mechanism, and this government said, yes, that's what I'm talking about, transparency in investment of the billions that we are borrowing. We cannot continue to be supply-driven in terms of development instead of the demand-driven trajectory that is required in a developing country. So, Mr. Speaker, as we do this, I saw also that one of the presidential candidates launching his manifesto yesterday said that one of the things they will do is debt restructuring. When they come into this government, they will do debt restructuring and request World Bank to restructure the debt. What are they saying? They're saying we are in the red and we require debt restructuring. Here we are saying we cannot do the next budget in this country without borrowing. That is what they're saying. We cannot do that. But they're saying we're going to restructure debt. Meaning, therefore, there's a problem. Why are we giving more? Why don't we allow the next government to come into this parliament and request for that money so that they're able to do their budget? Because they're saying we require, and everybody in this country, everybody is saying there's a problem with debt in this country. But here we are today, going on a different trajectory and saying we want to allow them to do another 10 trillion. Mr. Speaker, I want to oppose that and say that it is not healthy for this country, and this country is going the Sri Lanka way. We had the oil factory in Mombasa, in Kilifi actually. They are closing down because of lack of dollars. Dollars have been scarce in this country. What does that tell us about the economy? Where is this economy going? We are mismanaging this economy. And you see, this leader of majority was once Minister for Finance. And he did well then. But now, he's been brainwashed by this government that he cannot use that knowledge to manage this economy better than he did that time. Why? Because he cannot stand to his president and tell him, Mr. President, this is the wrong way to go. Then he could do it because it was Kibaki. Now, this president, he cannot handle him. Because he cannot handle him, he says yes to everything, including borrowing in a way that is not acceptable in this country. Mr. Speaker, I want to oppose this, and I urge the members in this to oppose this and teach these people a lesson that you cannot take this parliament for granted. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Dagoretti South.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. And it would be us hiding our head in the sand to say that we do not have a debt problem in this country. Mr. Speaker, truth be told, we have a big debt problem in this country, Mr. Speaker. And that is why I want to cling on a Freudian slip made by the leader of majority this afternoon, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the psychologists tell us that you can sleep and say what you're thinking without wanting to say it. The leader of majority has told us that we are just about to swallow a very bitter pill. And that is the truth. It was a Freudian slip. He corrected it, but that was in his mind, and it is the truth. Mr. Speaker, this is a country that is at the height of its borrowing during COVID, was borrowing 2.5 million shillings every day, adding to the debt bill that we have in this country, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, we have to just agree when is now the right time to stop digging the hole. Because the English tell us that when you find yourself in a hole, you have to decide to first stop digging, and then you can start climbing out of that hole, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is true what has been said. It is also true that borrowing is not the problem, Mr. Speaker. Borrowing has never been the problem, Mr. Speaker. The style with which Kenya is borrowing is the problem. The style with which Kenya is borrowing is unique. So the examples that we have been given here, Mr. Speaker, do not apply. No one borrows in the way Kenya borrows. No one utilizes borrowed money in the manner with which Kenya has been utilizing borrowed money. Mr. Speaker, I would like to, before saying why I oppose this, to first exonerate the Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Speaker. I am a member of the Justice and Legal Affairs Committee, Mr. Speaker, and I have friends in the delegated committee, Mr. Speaker.
What's the issue, member? What's the issue, Honorable Kizito? Member for Shinyalu, what is your problem?
Thank you, Speaker. But before I put my point of order, I wanted to first of all apologize for my phone. I left it on, and I regret for that. Thank you. Looking at the House and the matter at hand, and also just wait, and looking at how people are debating and repetition, the repetition going on, Mr. Speaker, I'm standing up on a standing order number 95 to request the mover to reply. Thank you. Will I be in order, sir?
Mr. Speaker,
okay, let the member for Dagoretti South complete. I'll put out. It is up to you, honourable members. It's indeed it's your decision. Let him finish.
Mr. Speaker, while I agree that the member for Shinyalu has the right to call for end of debate at any point, I've got to remind him that this is probably the most important business that this House will be undertaking before we close in a die, Mr. Speaker. And the fact that even tomorrow in the headlines, you can be sure the headlines will be reading that this House has actually lifted the borrowing cap for this country to 10 million, Mr. Speaker, and unprocedurally so, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, allow me to just prosecute my points, and then we can handle the matter that has been raised by the Honorable Member for Shinyalu. Mr. Speaker, before I had ceded the floor, I was saying that before I say why I'm opposing this, I would like to exonerate the Chairman Budget Emeritus, Mr. Speaker, because a few things have been said here which are not true, Mr. Speaker. It could not be further from the truth that the chairman was a party to raising the debt ceiling to 9 trillion, Mr. Speaker. I do remember very well, I, as a member of the Justice Legal Affairs Committee, had a consultation with friends who are from the delegated committee. And I remember at the point when we were talking about raising the debt ceiling, the Chair Emeritus Budget actually spoke at a tripartite meeting of the Finance Committee, the Delegated Committee, and the Budget Committee, where he was saying that this decision cannot be a unilateral decision by one committee. And he was actually even proposing that if we have to raise the debt ceiling, we can only raise it to around 7.5 million Kenya shillings. But Mr. Speaker, that was not the issue. The issue is that we keep digging ourselves deeper into a hole. We were here when we were debating the budget policy statement. And I was among the people who rose here and said that the deficit margin that we have been left with is only 426 million Kenya shillings. At that point, they were seeking to do an amendment to raise it to 800 billion Kenya shillings. Mr. Speaker, at that point, if we had made the right decision, we would not be finding ourselves in the problem that we find ourselves of not being able to finance the budget this year, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I did listen very carefully to the leader of majority, and he was saying that he has some lessons that he can give us, in our free time. And I do pray, Mr. Speaker, that some of these lessons that the leader of majority would give this House is how the Kibaki government was able to fully finance its budget without having to unnecessarily borrow. Because, Mr. Speaker, the truth of the matter is that when we borrow, we are not getting free money. Mr. Speaker, when we borrow, we are actually borrowing from the future. When we steal borrowed money, we are actually stealing from the future. Mr. Speaker, the monies that we have been borrowing, that we cannot account for, getting into contracts that we cannot make public, contracts that this House has been asking for to be presented into this House, so that this House is able to interrogate them, even as we are going into the budget cycle. If we knew what we owe and what the terms are with the SGR contract, if we knew what we borrowed for the expressway and what the terms of that contract are, this House would be better informed to be making these decisions, because this is the budget-making House, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the cycle of debt is such that debt with, given at a time of boom can actually push an economy, Mr. Speaker. But what normally happens is that a country can get excited with borrowing, especially if they are able to borrow easily. Now, what happens is that this boom ends up being a heavy yoke on the neck of that country, and that is where we are headed, Mr. Speaker, because we were borrowing prudently in the Kibaki government. We had a semblance of sensible borrowing in the first term of Jubilee government, but by the time we were getting to the second term of the Jubilee government, our borrowing had actually gone haywire, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, these monies that we are borrowing in such a manner is actually a debt that we are putting on the future of this country, Mr. Speaker, because a boom, the cycles have proved, economic cycles have proved that any economic boom driven by debt is normally followed by a very major slump, Mr. Speaker. And the slump here is going to be informed by many issues, some of which are beyond this country's ability. We have an economic downturn globally, Mr. Speaker. We have the effects of COVID, Mr. Speaker. Now, if this slump finds us in a big debt problem, actually we'll end up shutting down this country and, in fact, mortgaging it to our lenders, who will now be demanding for money that we do not have, because our budget cannot even finance the repayments of the loans that we have borrowed so far, Mr. Speaker. So if our budget cannot finance what we have borrowed, Mr. Speaker, we are now borrowing to pay the people who we had borrowed from earlier. So borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, which now ends up giving us a problem even when we come to our development budget, Mr. Speaker, because if we are repaying debts to the tune of over 1 trillion Kenya shillings, Mr. Speaker, then where do we find money to now go into development? But, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say that finally, when we were talking about the medium-term debt strategy, this issue did come up. So, Mr. Speaker, today we cannot afford to push the can further down the road. Let us say no to the increase of the debt ceiling, Mr. Speaker. Let us stop digging the hole. Let us start climbing up from the hole that we have, so that, Mr. Speaker, we can only consume that which we have in terms of our resources, and we stop consuming that which we have not made, thinking that it is free money being given to us, while we know it is not a grant, it is actually a loan that we have to pay. And if Kenya did not borrow even an extra shilling today, we would pay the debts we have up to the year 2099, meaning that generations after us will have to pay dearly for the mistakes that we might end up making today. Mr. Speaker, I oppose vehemently to the rising of the debt ceiling in this country. Mr. Speaker.
Sorry, be looking at the light here. The yellow one tells you you have 60 seconds. The red one tells you you have 30 seconds. So you organize your contribution that way. Now, the member for Shinyalu did rise in his place and claimed that the mover be called upon to reply. Let me put that to UP members to make that decision. So I put the question that the mover be called upon to reply. Will as many as that opinion say aye? Aye. Will as many as the contrary opinion say nay? Nay. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Mover.
Thank you. Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, this is a very important motion, and I'm very happy that members have been able to ventilate and put on record some of the sentiments which no doubt the administrations to come will follow. Honorable Speaker, I think for the record, it's important to internalize one thing, that because I think there's an issue that has been raised and I would want to just have that and I'll have replied. Transparency on debt. This year, we have a budget deficit of 846 billion, which is part of budget support. If you move back 10 years, times 10 is about 8 trillion that has gone towards budget support. But that is for the Public Accounts Committee to interrogate for us. But I want to assure you that what we are doing is a stopgap measure, like I said. It's important for purposes of moving forward, and I believe this House will facilitate the next administration coming in on the 9th of August 2022, whoever that will be able to take over an economy, and then they sort out the rest themselves. I beg to reply.
Honourable members, from the clerks department, the House still has the requisite quorum. I therefore put the question that pursuant to the provisions of Section 50, subsection 2 of the Public Finance Management Act of 2012, this House approves the Public Finance Management (National Government) Amendment Regulations of 2022, published as legal notice number 89 on 26th of May 2022, thus approving the amendment made to the Public Finance Management National Government Regulations of 2015, being the principal regulations, in Regulation 26, Subregulation 1, by deleting paragraph C and substituting therefore the following new paragraph C, in brackets. Pursuant to the provisions of Section 50, subsection 2 of the Act, the public debt shall not exceed 10 trillion shillings, close the quotes. Will as many as of that opinion say aye? Aye. Will as many as the contrary opinion say nay? Nay. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Go to the, now we go back to order number 14. Order number 14.
Order number 14, the Appropriation Bill, National Assembly Bill number 31 of 2022, second reading.
Chairman of Budget and Appropriations Committee.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. And again, Honorable Speaker, I want to really thank you for your wisdom in, first of all, dispensing off with the issue of the debt ceiling, so that all the issues now we will be discussing in the budget that we will be discussing, of course, Honorable Speaker, it will be within the said debt ceiling. Honorable Speaker, I beg to move that the appropriations bill number National Assembly number 31 of 2022 be read a second time. Honorable Speaker, this is an issue that we have actually